What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking the 4th albums from melodic death metal bands. Alright, so let's start with a classic here in Carcass and Heartwork, one of the true blueprints of melodic death metal as we know it, and from one of the most stylistically flexible bands out there. So much so that this album gets to top out both the melodic death metal and classic death metal 4th album lists. Dropping in 1993 in the UK and 94 in the US, this predates other classic albums in the genre like The Jester Race and The Gallery, and another one we'll get to later. I love the fusion of their extreme roots with the more melodic hooks. A great album all the way through, but my personal favorites here are Carnal Forge, No Love Lost, and Death Certificate. And bonus, it also features artwork from H.R. Giger, one of my favorites. Number 51 on Rolling Stone's 100 Greatest Metal Albums of All Time. Of course, it has to go to perfection. Then we have Children of Bodom with Hate Crew Deathroll. So we finally got into one of my personal favorites, Children of Bodom albums. I enjoy the ones leading up to it, especially Follow the Reaper, which we just discussed in the last video, but to me, this is where they take all the elements they've been working on and pretty much perfect them. The hooks are even stronger, the vocals more anthemic, and the solos as insane as ever, and I also think it's one of their more consistent albums all the way through. Needled 24/7 is an awesome opener and a top 10 track for the band. It's like 75% hooks. This then followed closely by the slower, more groovy, but no less infectious 6-pounder. Bodom Beach Terror is another headbanger with great synth work to complement the start-stop riffing, and speaking of which, gotta love that synth hook on the title track. Lil Blood Riding Hood is also fun despite the really corny title. This hit number 1 on the finished album charts and stayed there for 2 weeks, and the video for Needled 24/7 got them some more mainstream exposure, and it's also the last album to be recorded with the original 5 members, and the only thing that keeps it just short of perfection for me is some of the rougher vocals here, which has been an issue on the other albums as well. Not as bad here, but I'm going to put it at fantastic. Then we have Kalmah with the Black Waltz. So first one with Marco Schneck on keys, and you can definitely hear a slight shift in sound right from the top. Not only in that, but also the lower register death growls. Personally, I kind of prefer the higher, raspier ones for their style, and they still make it work with all of the great hooks. It just takes some of the fun out of it for me, and it just feels a little bit off. Like, it would have been nice to have at least had a mix. Defeat is another great opener, and then other great tracks like Bitter Metallic Side with Terminal Intensity, Mind Rust, Man of the King, despite that goofy opening. Metal Storm fans have the first 4 albums all tied for top score with a sudden drop off right after this one. Personally, it's not one of my favorites, but still solid and very consistent. I'm going to go ahead and put this one at great tier. And as always, this is just my subjective take, so put your own thoughts in the comments on albums you would have put higher and why. Alright, Nightrage, Wearing the Martyr's Crown. This one kicks off with a vengeance on Shed the Blood. Classic Soilwork vibes here. Love the Spanish guitar at the end of Collision of Fate. More great classic In Flames influenced riffing and shredding solos. It's a really consistently raging album, though I will say at almost an hour it does lose some steam in the second half. Scale the runtime down a bit and I could see this being like top tier stuff, but as it stands and with the stark competition, which we're gonna bring up a few times here, it just can't quite compete, so I'm going to put it at good tier. Alright, Omnium Gatherum with the Red Shift. So the riffs keep getting better with this band every album, but the vocals just don't. They do eventually overcome this, and I'm excited to hopefully get to those albums because I've just been like dumping them in the bottom tier every time. But unfortunately, this is another one where the vocals just do not do it for me at all, and it's sad since the guitar work is excellent, but this one's just going to go at okay. Not my thing. Alright, on the other hand, I'm very excited that we finally get to talk about Arch Enemy with Wages of Sin. So we did it. We made it to the Angela Gossow era, which I think is the band's best era. She's just a much stronger vocal presence than Johan was. And this is another album that was my introduction to the band, and Enemy Within continues to be my favorite Arch Enemy song to this day. What an incredible build-up with the piano into the pounding drums, and then that 10 out of 10 riff. Just chef's kiss. Whenever there's a discussion of the best album openers out there, this is always the first song that comes to mind for me. And fortunately, there are plenty of other great tracks here too, like Burning Angel with those dueling leads. The thrashy riffing on Ravenous sounds incredible, especially with them shifting to the C tuning for this album. Love those big epic guitar harmonies. Savage Messiah shows some dynamics with that ominous bluesy riff slowly building into the hypnotic head bobbing of the chuggy part. The First Deadly Sin is yet another standout, contrasting with the insane speed of the verses and the slow, groovy chorus, and Angela sounds absolutely demonic on this track. It's also the top fan rated album on Metal Storm and easily my favorite of their discography as well. I'll tell you, a couple of albums had to really duke it out for the top tier, but ultimately, re-listening to it this time, it was obvious this needed to go to perfection, and I felt like Arch Enemy really needed a win after those early ones. Speaking of which, let's move on to Insomnium, which was also in the running with Across the Dark. So continuing to maintain top positions throughout this series, and this is yet another great entry. Where the Last Wave Broke is an incredible track, channeling that classic harmonized Gothenburg riffing. Also continuing to have some of the best atmosphere on this list with the big triumphant melodies of the Harrowing Years. Alexo Munter of Swallow the Sun further adds to that element on this album, providing some additional guest keys. Plenty of other standouts too, Against the Stream, The Lay of Autumn. Also, just a really tight album at only 8 songs over 45 minutes. And so yeah, this one could have easily fitted perfection. It was up there for a while, but it kind of got bounced up and down, and ultimately it just barely missed the cut. I'm going to put it at fantastic, but again, like, it could be right up there with the classics. And I also have to say that this is going to be a tough discography to rank when that time comes. All right, next we have Amon Amarth with Versus the World, and this will probably be one of the more controversial picks on this list because I know many people, including Quest for Metal, really enjoy this album, but I personally find it to be a little bit dull in comparison to the older stuff, and also what I consider to be superior albums of this era, like With Odin on Our Side. I just find it so slow and kind of repetitive. I love the opening track, Death and Fire, probably my personal favorite on the album, and I can also enjoy the stab wounds in our backs, Across the Rainbow Bridge, and the title track, but it's just not really an album that I enjoy listening to from start to finish. Like, it has great atmosphere, no denying that, and I just don't know, something about it just never gelled with me even from the beginning, and every time I re-listen to it, I leave with this kind of like, I respect it, but there are just other albums in their discography and on this list that I would rather be listening to. So yeah, this is gonna hurt some of you, but I'm just gonna put it down at good. And another example of why I renamed these tiers the way that I did, because I do think it is still a very good album. It's just lower down on this ranking. All right, Moore's Principium Est and Death Said Live. So this is another solid album in this Finnish band's very consistent discography. I will say it's kind of more the same at this point, but bringing that same emphasis on guitar work and a seemingly just unending stream of hooks. Like, maybe not as memorable as the last 2 albums, and I feel like the production isn't quite as strong either, but still highly recommended with plenty of great tracks like Departure, I Will Return, Birth of the Star Child, What the Future Holds, The Medals of Asphodel, and Dead Winds of Hope, which I've just named at least like half the album. So really good stuff, but again, stark competition here. I'm going to put this one at great tier. Oh, we have Bellicor with Vessels. So I already raved about Of Breath and Bone on the last video, and I'd say Vessels is basically tied for best, if not just slightly edging it out with the songwriting. And this most recent re-listen, like, I went into the Discord and even said, like, man, I almost forgot just how fucking good this album is, because I loved it when it dropped, but every time I listen to it, it just keeps getting better. It's a must listen for both melodic death metal fans and progressive death metal fans alike, with a perfect blend of atmosphere and really engaging performances. It's almost like this weird fusion of Insomnium with Opeth and Amon Amarth, and really incorporating elements of almost every band on this list. Top tracks here on Ember's Arc, Roots to Sever, and The Smoke of Many Fires, but really, if you have an hour to spare, it's definitely worth taking it start to finish. One of my favorite albums of 2016, some really great piano work on here too. I'm going to put this one at fantastic. I almost want to put it at perfection, but again, stark competition. Let's keep moving. All right, The Haunted with Revolver. So this is them switching back to Peter Dolving on the vocals with this one. And I remember being pretty let down when it came out with the more rock-oriented outcome. There are still some great riffs to be found, but the pendulum swings back more in favor of Pantera here. I've been mentioning each video kind of the ratio of Pantera to melodic death metal on these albums. And yeah, here it's just not as good, and I just prefer Marco personally. And I could definitely do without the Yarly clean vocals on Abysmal and All Against All and Burnt to a Shell. Like, there's quite a few moments on here where I'm just like, please, can we not do this? I can't appreciate No Compromise, Sabotage, Who Will Decide, basically the tracks that feel like a more like Melodeath band's take on Hatebreed. So not terrible, but a huge step down in my opinion, and I'm dropping them to okay, not my thing. Not the absolute bottom, but pretty low. All right, another one that's always tough for me is Dark Tranquillity, Projector. So this is definitely one of those albums in their discography with a bit of a bad reputation, and kind of understandably so, because it was a big shift to more like gothic influences, and the runtime is definitely one of their least consistent, very sort of bloated feeling, lots of filler. That said, I have kind of a soft spot for it, and it's not without some standouts in Free Card, Undue Control, Exposure, and especially Therein, which was a real treat to see them play live just a few years back and just belt out the chorus with the crowd. Definitely have a very soft spot for that song in particular. So not quite at the bottom, but it's definitely lower on this list. I'm going to put it at good. And then we also get to one of my favorite In Flames albums with Colony. So I think much like what I said about Children of Bodom, I think this is In Flames taking all of the best elements of their sound and taking them to the absolute highest point here. Very consistent runtime, but with plenty of standouts too, like Embody the Invisible, Colony, and Zombie Inc. All of those soaring melodies just surround you the entire runtime. I know some fans had qualms with starting to incorporate some clean vocals on tracks like Ordinary Story, but I think in small doses it works just fine, especially alongside the piano. This version of their lineup remained the same too from 1999 to 2010, and I agree with a lot of people that it is one of their best lineups. This was also named on Metal Hammer's top 20 best metal albums of 1999, and I'm going to go ahead and put it up at fantastic. And I will say too, this and Insomnium were my last final choices when I was figuring out my lock-in for this ranking, and I ultimately had to poll you all in the audience on the community tab, and y'all pretty resoundingly went with In Flames. It was about 75-25 for Insomnium. So appreciate the help. All right, then we have Soilwork with Natural Born Chaos, and this was yet another album that introduced me to the band. Follow the Hollow is definitely a classic and one of my favorite songs from them. No small wonder that it got me hooked with that chorus, which is just insanely catchy. The production also sounds great thanks to Devin Townsend. Definitely leaning even more into the melodic side of their sound with lots of atmosphere and some great songs here as well with As We Speak, The Flame Out, Black Star Deceiver. I've been through a lot of ups and downs though with this album myself. Like, I loved it when I bought it on CD at Best Buy back in the day. I can vividly remember getting my mom to buy it for me and waiting in line looking at the cover. Then after a while I started to kind of find it corny, but now I've circled back and I'm enjoying it again, even if I do think it's a little inconsistent and honestly a little bit overrated. It's probably my favorite of the post-Steelbath material, but I still prefer those earlier albums, and frankly I think there are more consistently enjoyable albums on this particular list. So ultimately it kind of started up relatively high, but as I listened to these more and more going through them, it got bumped down and landed at great tier. All right, then we have the Black Dahlia Murder with Deflorate, and this is another one I see a lot of mixed reactions to. The fan ratings on Metal Storm are actually kind of low, but I definitely fall into the camp of really loving it. Like, I do think something feels a little bit off maybe with the production, but it's also the first album with Ryan Knight on guitar, who is just a powerhouse. More excellent tracks here too, like Necropolis, Denounced, Disgraced, Death Panorama, and I Will Return, to name just a few of my favorites. But really, there's not a track on here that I don't like, or like don't really like. I kind of love every track on this thing. It's really fun. And as far as my desire for non-stop riffage and just delivering absolutely vicious vocals in both highs and lows, it's hard for me to not rank it pretty high. So I'm going to put this one at fantastic. All right, Hypocrisy gets to join the party here with Abducted, so making the jump from old school death metal to melodic death metal with kind of an entombed vibe, sort of, and with some at the gates flair too. Lots of HM2 either way. That classic production definitely makes the melodies on tracks like Killing Art really take hold, and I also dig Buried, Point of No Return, and the more atmospheric elements towards the end. Vocals also kind of interesting with the brutal stuff mixed in with the higher snarls. Pretty good mix of slower and faster stuff too, so I like this one enough, and I actually wanted to put it higher. It was another one that I initially listened to earlier than some of the other ones, and it started up at maybe even around Fantastic and slowly kind of made its way down as it got bumped by my favorites. So ultimately it landed at good tier, but pretty high up on there. Scar Symmetry, Dark Matter, Dimensions. So some of the best clean vocals on this list for sure, on top of more great riffing. In 2009, the genre was kind of on the decline, so this is another very strong entry for that time frame. Awesome atmosphere on Noumenon and Phenomenon, and the title track, Ascension Chamber, is super catchy. Mechanical Soul Cybernetics has an absolutely shredding solo on it. Just a really epic sounding album all around, and for something that I hadn't really paid a lot of attention to, missed out on at the time, and it's great circling back to it. So maybe a touch overlong, but no weak tracks, and honestly, I think it's actually a little bit better than this Soilwork album. And I actually wanted to include it at Fantastic, but once again, tough competition. It got bumped down to Great, but I'm actually going to put it all the way at the top of Great tier. And then we opened on a classic, and we're going to end on a classic with At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul, the best album to get away with using papyrus font. And of course, one of the most lauded melodic death metal albums of all time, responsible for both setting a new bar for how the genre would sound moving forwards, as well as, for better or worse depending on how you look at it, inspire an entire wave of musicians to repurpose these riffs within the metalcore genre. I feel like most of what I could say about this album pretty much goes without saying at this point, and you can already hear more of my thoughts in my At the Gates discography tier list, but in short, it truly is a landmark album. My personal favorite tracks being Cold, Suicide Nation, the title track, and of course, Blinded by Fear. It's going to perfection. Check out more melodic death metal tier lists in this playlist, and let me know what is your favorite album on this list down below. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.